and welcome to Ipsy Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Luce Nguyen. Today I'm interviewing Henrique Moraes, a diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil since 2004. He is also a PhD candidate at the Center for Global Governance Studies of Leuven University in Belgium. Today we will talk about his paper, The Geoeconomic Challenge to International Economic Law, Lessons from the Regulation of Data in China. This paper was written for Henrique's doctoral research at Leuven University, and he is speaking within his personal capacity. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Luz.
So let's begin by talking about why did you write this article and what inspired you to write this article?
So the article looks at specifically at data regulation in China, and in the article, I look specifically at the restrictions imposed by the Chinese legislation to cross-border data flows. And my argument there is that the way the data regulation is designed in China serves what I am calling a geoeconomic purpose, and I think we'll have time to break down what that means specifically. But my point is that data regulation in China serves this geoeconomic purpose, which specifically is to retain in China data, which is a valuable asset, among other things, to contribute to China's tech catch-up, and specifically in the area of artificial intelligence. So that is the case that I study in the article. But the article is in fact part of a broader project which aims to depict what I think is a larger shift that is taking place and that is changing the logic underlying economic relations. Now, this project where we look at what are these geoeconomic shifts to economic relations, it's a research that I started a while ago with two colleagues from Australia. One of them, Anthea Roberts, professor at the Australian National University in Canberra, and the other is Victor Ferguson, who is a PhD researcher at this same university. So for more or less a year, we've been doing this research that aims basically at trying to devise a framework to understand what is going on in the global economic relations, but specifically what impacts these shifts can generate over international economic law. So we have been, for the past year, worked on trying to come up with this framework, which is centered on the idea of geoeconomics. And this paper that we're discussing in the show today is sort of a spin-off from this research. It's a case study for this broader research in which I try to, let's say, spell out, looking at the data regulation case in China, the impacts of geoeconomics over international economic law more broadly. I could say that the article, it looks at one aspect, the Chinese side or a Chinese example of a larger story. And I think we'll have time to discuss during the show today the other aspects and what this larger story is. But that's why I wrote the article. The article then is a case study for a broader project, and the broader project is aimed at trying to make sense of what is going on in the global economic relations and how these shifts that we are all witnessing, how they impact international economic law going forward.
So let's talk about international economic relations. You talk about a clash of economic models and geoeconomics. Can you talk about those things?
Sure. So the idea of a clash of economic models, I think it's central to understand the moment where we are. I think today it's increasingly undeniable that when you look at the way the U.S. or let's say more broadly the Western economic model is shaped, there are many contradictions, let's say, when you compare it to the Chinese economic model. So there are differences, but of course, this is not the first time that alternative or let's say new economic models emerge. The point that I think is new, and this is an important question underlying this research to single out what is new in what we are witnessing, is that China not only has its own economic model that, of course, relies more on the presence of the state and operates by a different rationale, and I think we can dig into that in a while. But the difference is that not only China is different, but the scale of China makes this contrast between its model and the, let's say, Western or market-oriented model more visible. And the idea of an emerging clash between economic models, it owes to the fact that there seems to be a perception today, and this seems to be clear in the US, for example, that China has not taken the path that was envisaged or desired for it to take, and that might have contributed to in the 20 years ago to allow it into institutions such as the WTO. So the moment where we are now, you clearly see that, and this is something that emerges from the debates in the US, there is a perception that China will not go in the direction of a market-oriented model as was desired or expected in the early 2000s. The thing is, China does not, from what we see, China does not or does not show any intention of changing the model that its economic model. And what becomes increasingly clear is that China is doubling down, and it understands that the economic model that it chose is a model that suits its particular circumstances, and there's no need to change it. And also because it has been a very successful model for the Chinese society. So not only you see a contradiction or a number of significant differences between the Chinese model and the, let's say, market-oriented model, but you see this entrenchment in the positions. And that's where the idea of a clash of economic models comes from. You see China confident that the model that they designed for themselves fits their needs, and actors such as the US, the EU, and Japan having a different view. But nobody is moving in the direction of some sort of convergence or some sort of interoperability, let's say, between the models. So you have a clash. And that is central because it makes the possibility of having agreed solutions at the international level more difficult, because and then I move to the second point: international economic law as we know it for the past, let's say, 25 years, in particular with the rules of the World Trade Organization. These rules, they build in, they have a lot of flexibilities, they have a lot of escape valves, but it builds in, and this is perhaps one of the central debates in international economic law today, but international economic law as we know it for the past 25 years builds in a number of assumptions that let's say, convey an idea that global economic relations are led primarily by market actors and not so much by the state, although there are rules that, of course, allow the state to take economic measures to pursue goals such as environment protection, health protection, etc. Aside from that, international economic law, compared to the situation where we have now, international economic law was premised on the notion that security and security concerns would be an exception to waive the rules. Whereas what we start to witness increasingly these days is that the notion of security or national security is expanding so as to encroach upon areas that until a couple of years ago were considered to be covered, let's say, almost exclusively by what we can call an economic mindset. So the idea of geoeconomics enters this equation because geoeconomics is the term that we think captures best some of the features of the shifts that we are witnessing, namely an increased presence of the state in disciplining, but also being an active player in economic relations, a logic of economic relations that is not predominantly a market-oriented logic, but increasingly a strategic logic that does not make often economic sense. And we can get to some examples if you want, but I think these notions are new in the dimension and magnitude that they take these days. And let's say if you take a step back and look at the broader picture, one of the major, let's say, shifts in perception from those ideas that inspired the international economic law as we have known for the last 25 years. And now, one of the most significant shifts is the idea of what it means to be interdependent. So in the late 90s, or mid 90s or late 90s, when the WTO was starting, this regime was starting to operate, clearly the inspiration was that the more economically interdependent, the better. That interdependence would generate efficiencies and all would gain. You fast forward to now, and the perception now is that, true, interdependence can generate efficiencies, but increasingly it also generates security vulnerabilities. So we need to plug these gaps. And this change in the perception of what it means to be interdependent has a lot of implications, not only politically, but also from an international economic law perspective. So basically, that's the context in which we try to make sense.
So I kind of want to go into the specifics here about the logic of international economic law, and particularly states' approaches to international economic organizations like the WTO. For example, America's national security tariffs on steel, their approach to the WTO appellate body, and China's approach to these international organizations, giving their contrasting economic model.
Okay, so what you see at the WTO, I think there are developments of different natures taking place at the WTO. Although, of course, you can always make the case that they are somehow interlinked. One of them is the U.S. Approach to the national security exception, or to the security exception of Article 21 of the GATT, and this, of course, relates to the measures that the U.S. imposed on steel and aluminum. I think another development is what is happening with respect to the appellate body, which is something that predates the current U.S. administration, and I think has to do with a different sort of frustrations that the U.S. have with respect to the way the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO works. Of course, they all contribute to the situation where we are now, in which, well, there's a paralysis, not only a paralysis in what is perhaps the most urgent and challenge, which is the dispute settlement pillar of the WTO, but also the very capacity of the WTO to continue to serve as a forum for countries to agree on multilateral rules because precisely of the clash of models. So I think these are two different challenges that we see at the WTO that affect directly the future of the WTO. But I think they are evidence of different shifts. Again, they might be interlinked. You can always make the case that somehow they are interlinked. And of course, the fact that the WTO faces challenges, these combined challenges, makes it hard to or harder to expect ambitious multilateral solutions for challenges in the global economy going forward. But just zooming in a bit at the WTO and the idea of clash of models, as I note in the article, the clash of models seems to be the clash of economic models seems to be very present at the WTO, and both the U.S. And China are very outspoken about their positions, and that gives us confidence to say that this clash of models is something that is becoming entrenched, and because just by following the debate at the WTO, you can see that, and that generates a number of concerns about what to expect from the WTO, but not only the WTO, about the capacity of countries as a whole to agree multilateral rules for topics that are crucial for the future of the global economy, such as digital trade. And at this very moment at the WTO, there are negotiations ongoing on electronic commerce. And this type of negotiation goes to the heart of not only the clash of models, but to all the questions that we are discussing today that have let's say, geoeconomic nature, in the sense that they appeal to not only economic interests, but also to strategic interests of, for example, who will lead in areas such as artificial intelligence. And the article is, I address the WTO negotiations on e-commerce in the article, but it's part of, even this e-commerce negotiation at the WTO, it's part of this larger story, and it will be impacted by this larger story. So just going back to my initial point, I think the idea of trying to come up with a framework to make sense of what's happening is because the clash of models that is crystallizing in these entrenched positions and different logics of let's say, governing international economic relations, it is pervasive, and it has implications for a number of areas of international economic law.
So let's talk about something you wrote about in your paper, geoeconomic chain reactions. What is this, and how does it differ from past economic relations between states?
Okay, that's a great question. So in the article, I make the point that we are witnessing a clash of models, and because this clash of models is becoming entrenched in the sense that actors such as the U.S. and the EU increasingly have realized that that their ability to shape China's behavior is very limited. So they're confronted with their inability to shape China's behavior or to induce in any way China to move in the direction that the US and the EU desired. So the US and increasingly the EU are reacting to China in a way that resembles, at least now, the way China behaves. So I think at the core of what I am calling this clash of models is the accusation and I'm not passing judgment whether it's correct or not, or whether China is right or wrong. I'm just stating a fact. There is the accusation that China does not behave like the other, or has not behaved like the other actors, meaning that while the other actors were playing by, let's say, a market-oriented logic in which market actors take the lead and the states are in the backseat in economic relations, China, on the other hand, plays by geoeconomic ways, in the sense that, in contrast to the US and the EU, in China, it's the state that is at the driver's seat, controlling economic relations and much more present in shaping the way China not only structures its economy domestically, but increasingly how China projects its economic presence globally. Now, being more concrete, one of the accusations is that, so for example, just to be very hypothetical example, but just to make it simple, if you are a U.S. company and you like Google, for example, and you think that there's an interesting technology somewhere else in a startup that you find interesting, or that can be developed or streamlined by Google goes and buy that company, right? They've done that with deep learning, the company that mastered crucial keys in unlocking artificial intelligence. So they did it, but it was a market actor. Whereas in the case of China, one of the accusations is that even when you have Chinese private actors acquiring companies and sometimes technologies abroad, many of these transactions are they have some sort of support from the state. And also, in many cases, it is the state indirectly through state-owned enterprises that acquires either technologies or what is called critical infrastructures, such as ports, for example. So the idea of China playing geoeconomically, I think it's captured by this example, where you see the state both acting through a state-owned enterprise or by financing a private actor to go and acquire something that is strategic. And that sometimes, and this is key also to understand the difference, sometimes economically does not make a lot of sense, either because it is a very long-term investment that would be outside of the reach of private actors, because, market actors do not tend to operate in the long term that a state can, such as the Chinese state. So, and sometimes the price of the transaction might be overblown, or to the point that you might make the case that from an economic perspective, the transaction does not make a lot of sense. So because there is this accusation that China has been playing by a different logic, so they play by a geoeconomic logic, actors such as the US and again the EU are starting to react also by deploying what we could call geoeconomic measures. So to take back again the example of these, let's say, subsidized acquisitions of companies and their technologies, you start to see as a reaction to that, that both in the US and also in the EU, but elsewhere in the world, a number of legislations imposing or strengthening what is called investment screening has been adopted. And by investment screening, you're basically talking about mechanisms whereby state national authorities will vet foreign investments to authorize or not a given transaction. So, for example, the news these days in the US is that the US authority that is responsible for investment screening, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, is apparently examining the acquisition of TikTok, the app, by a Chinese company, and that is because, well, there are not many details because CFIUS decisions and investigations are not public, so it's not really clear exactly what triggered this investigation. But given the access of TikTok to data, a number of analysts are asking the question whether it is because by acquiring TikTok, a Chinese company and perhaps the Chinese state might get access to data of Americans and perhaps of other countries, but in this case of Americans, that might be considered a strategic asset that might not be in the interest of the U.S. to let fall in Chinese hands. So by this case of, let's say, by this example of subsidized takeovers by Chinese companies, both public or not, and by a reaction taking the shape of investment screening mechanisms to prevent some investment transactions in strategic assets, this is an example of what I am calling this geoeconomic chain reaction, in the sense that actors that until now have been acting inspired by a market-oriented logic, they start to change the way they operate, especially with respect to China, to react also by deploying geoeconomic measures.
So let's go on to what you were talking about earlier. Let's talk about data and data localization and why you chose to focus on it in this paper.
Okay. So I mentioned before that the article, it sheds light on one aspect of a larger story. The larger story is the story of the clash of models, and how, because China is accused of acting guided by a geoeconomic rationale instead of a market-oriented one, other actors are reacting also by deploying geoeconomic measures, and this geoeconomic chain reaction risks reshaping the entire architecture and the logic of international economic law. This is the larger story. Now, to make the case of what kind of impacts this larger story might create for international economic law going forward, in this article I look at one case, the case of how the Chinese regulate data. I think just as a footnote, another example, but on the other side of this story, looking, for example, to the US, would be to examine the investment screening legislation in the US as a geoeconomic measure. Now let's go to data. So data is key and will become even more crucial in the future of the economy, which is increasingly becoming digital. And data is a crucial input for the digital economy. In many ways, data, a lot of people will compare data to oil. So you will hear a lot that data is the new oil. You will also hear a lot of people saying that it's not really a good analogy. But what I think the message that this kind of analogy purports to convey, I think, is that you're talking about a very important input for the digital economy, and that is true. So, for example, when you look at China, China is a country of 1.4 billion people, and something like 900 million people are online. They have access to internet, and in a way that is different from, let's say, the West, in the sense that a number of activities are done using the internet in China, and not only by internet, but mobile internet. So the point is that in China, not only the volume, but the depth and breadth of data that is generated by users is more, let's say, granular. So if you are a company that you have an app in China, like WeChat, for example, you have access to a number of transactions, behaviors of your users that normally Western companies such as Facebook and Google do not have, because people do more things online and mobile in China. So they generate a data footprint. Now, why is data important? It's important for many things, but in the article I make the case, and I'm not the first one, of course, to do that. Data is the key input for the development of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence will be a central tool in a number of applications in the future economy, from driverless cars to the way you go to the supermarket. Some of the let's say professions in medicine will be replaced by not robots but by artificial intelligence, because some of the expertise is routine, so you can outsource it or automate it. So it will be very important. But the way you in order to refine artificial intelligence, you need to expose, and artificial intelligence is a set of technologies. It's not one technology, but you need to expose it to a large amount of data so that it can be refined and more precise. And the point then is that if you have access to a lot of data, you have an advantage in the sense that you have more, let's say, material to test and to refine your artificial intelligence. The point I make in the article is that data regulation in China restricts the outflow of data from China to the world. So basically, what this the regulation does is to retain within China the data from this roughly 900 million people, which is a lot of data, so that China can have at its disposal for its domestic research and development this huge volume of data. I mean, you take the number of people that are online in China, and it's more than the US and the EU combined. So it's a lot of data being generated there. Of course, you can make the case, and this is again a footnote, that for some cases, the data generated in China, it's biased. So for example, for facial recognition, some people make the case that there's a lot of data in China, that's true, but it's biased in the sense that it is very good in recognizing Asian faces, but not African faces or Latin faces or Western faces. And that is a good point. But for a number of other applications, to be sitting on data of 900 million people is a great advantage. So the point I make in the article is that restrictions to outflow of data from China, they serve a number of purposes. You can claim that reasonably, that these restrictions, they serve interests of security, more directly related to surveillance, monitoring. That is, I'm not discussing that. But my point is that on top of all these objectives, the restrictions imposed in China are also an important tool to leverage China's position as a possible leader in developing artificial intelligence. And that's what they are doing. They are, in many areas, they have advanced a lot. So that's the point I make in the article. You're talking about data as a crucial asset for the development or advancement of artificial intelligence. And the point is to look at how regulations in China cater to this goal. And of course, by looking at that, in the article, I project a number of implications for global regulation on data.
So why is it important that for increasing amounts of economic transactions, the United States might see data like the acquisition of TikTok as an issue of national security, and the Chinese sees data as a, quote, strategic asset? Why is that important?
Because, so the reason why the U.S., the CFIUS, began this investigation, it's not clear, but a number of people assume that it's because there is a concern that data from the users in the US might be transferred to the Chinese state that can weaponize this kind of data. I will use, I think, perhaps another recent example, also in the U.S., perhaps makes the case clearer, which is a decision that has been taken by the U.S. authorities, CFIUS, regarding another app, Grindr, this gay dating app. So the decision taken in the U.S. was to order a Chinese company that acquired the app to sell its share and its stakes in the app, because it was understood that access to data of this nature could be used against the security interests of the U.S. And that makes perfect sense, given the logic that we are in, right? So that's why data is important, because in the context which we are in, data and control to data has a number of implications. In the article, I look at the implication of data as an input for artificial intelligence. In the case of Grindr, you're looking at data as an input that could be weaponized against the U.S. It's a different application, let's say, but it shows how crucial access to data is these days. But this question that you ask is also very interesting, because it shows that one of the features, let's say, one of the interesting elements of the world we're living in is that is the idea of trust. And I think this harks back to what I mentioned before about the changing perception of interdependence. So in the past, in the recent past, interdependence was predominantly seen as a force for good, because there was trust that nobody would weaponize to a significant extent to its gains. The fact that economic relations were intense, and that some countries would, let's say, depend more on certain markets, because the prevalent idea was that overall everybody would gain. So it's the idea of the tide that would lift all the boats. Now, this has changed today, and there clearly is an element of distrust, especially with respect to China, that changes the signal. And this has systemic implications, to the point that, for example, going back to the investment screening mechanisms, a couple of years ago, most countries would welcome foreign investments with their open arms. And security concerns would be residual in the cases where security concerns would lead to veto a transaction involving foreign investment was negligible. Now it's different, because precisely of this element of distrust, which is, as I said before, it is crucial to understand the direction things are taking, and how international economic law might look like in the future.
So let's talk about the internet governance models that the West and China use in relation to how the global internet should be structured. The contrast between the Western multi-stakeholder model versus the Chinese and others focus on cyber sovereignty. How does that affect all of this?
So this is it's another very good question. The internet, in a way, is the perception of the internet today. It has suffered, I think, more or less what I was referring to when I was talking about investments a while ago. So in the beginning, the internet was understood as this space, this apolitical space, free from politics, borderless space where everybody would have an equal voice. And you fast forward to now, and it's a different perception. Now, of course, you have different views on how the internet should be governed, and this is a very key question, especially given the stage we're entering in the global economy, where it becomes increasingly digital, and meaning that the infrastructure through which most of the transactions will take place is the internet. So the way the internet governance is structured is very important. I think this will, given the increasing importance of digital, digital economy for the future of the international economy, these differences will probably lead to the emergence of, at least in some areas, some spheres of influence, a fragmentation of the way we operate. And in some ways, the internet, from an economic perspective, is fragmented. If you look to the fact that if you see that, for example, apps such as Twitter and Facebook, they are not allowed to operate in countries such as China. So you already see what some analysts call the splinter net, in the sense that you have different regimes within the internet. And I think that when you look at areas such as data flows, and given the clash of models, which, for example, if you apply to the internet, it's exactly what is happening. It's a part of the clash of economic models. You might see the emergence of these spheres of influence that will perhaps fragment international economic law from something that is multilateral to different regimes centered around some hubs, or what two professors, Susan Aronson and Patrick LeBlanc, call the data realms, where you have different regimes regulating data flows. But I have to say that in a significant extent, some of the things that we're seeing, but not only in China and Russia, they have been catalyzed by the Snowden revelations in the U.S., where I think that the U.S. lost some face, and especially, and all this narrative of multi-stakeholder, when it was revealed that this let's say what was thought to be predominantly a market-driven, apolitical space was in fact being weaponized or deployed by the United States for its purposes. So I think that didn't help, in the sense that then Europe started to pursue its own path. And then you have the privacy concerns, the GDPR, which is the EU legislation on privacy protection at the digital environment. And of course, this also gives some degree of confidence for actors such as China and Russia to pursue their own view of the internet. But you are right; it's the internet and how it is governed it's an interesting context to watch, because I think it will give us some elements to understand how also international economic law will be shaped going forward.
So, big question.
Okay.
I ask everyone this: why do the underlying effects in your paper matter? Why does all of these developments matter?
So I think they matter because it helps make sense of what is going on. If you're an international lawyer or if you're a market operator, you will be confronted and you have to understand the logic behind what's going on, because I think that we are very likely to witness an increased fragmentation of international economic law, as I mentioned in the example of data. I think it's very likely that we start to see emerging not multilateral rules on a number of areas, but rules that are set by some actors such as China, the US, and Europe. So if you want to operate in China, you will have to abide by the Chinese rules. In Europe, the same thing for Europe, and the US, the same thing. The question will be what will prevail in third markets. But I think we should expect more fragmentation, and you will only expect more fragmentation if you manage to see that what is going on is happening because of a different logic. There has been a change, or we start to see a change in the logic inspiring economic relations away from the logic that has prevailed until now, and more towards a geoeconomic logic. So I'm not claiming here, and my other colleagues with whom I did the research, we're not claiming that the old order is over and everything is geoeconomic now. So we're trying to take a picture of what is happening and try to make sense of it. So an increased fragmentation is a very likely development in some key areas. And with that, you will start to see an increase in domestic regulation, especially because a number of areas are being considered by key actors, the US, China, and Europe, as national security, when until a while ago they were left to the normal interplay of market forces. So areas that would perhaps be regulated multilaterally will increasingly be regulated domestically. And this, of course, generates a high degree of unpredictability if you're a market actor. You will have, for example, if you are structuring global value chains, well, the very idea of global value chains is under threat in some sectors. Because whereas in the recent past, you as a corporation could simply design your supply chains across the globe according to cost effectiveness, now you have to also factor in political factors. And this has a number of implications for international law. And so I think the main takeaway from the article and from this research on geoeconomics is to make the case that the logic underlying economic relations is changing. So this is an ongoing process. And we try to point to the direction where they're headed to. And we draw conclusions or possible conclusions as to what international economic law might look like going forward.
All right. As a final question, what should the listeners of this podcast, your fellow scholars, and national policymakers in both the West and in the East take away from this paper?
So I think we should take away that, and many are realizing that something different is happening. It's not something that we've seen before. In particular, given the scale of China, it's a different order of challenges. I think there's a new logic that is emerging and inspiring economic relations, and we should make sense of that. First, to understand what is happening, but also, importantly, to try to shape so that we can preserve a number of conquests, let's say, from a legal perspective, that have been achieved in the past years in terms of having multilateral rules, ensuring some degree of predictability for market actors. And I think it all begins by understanding the big picture, what is changing, and that's what we try to do. We don't try to zoom in specific manifestations of the changing logic by themselves, but we try to portray the broader picture to give people a vocabulary to frame discussions.
Well, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast to discuss your very interesting paper.
It was my pleasure, Luz.
There is no body of our people, whose interests are more inextricably interwoven with interests of all the people, and is the case with the farmer. The Country Life Commission should be revived with greatly increased powers. Its abandonment was a severe blow to the interests of our people. The welfare of the farmer is a basic need of this nation. It is the men from the farm who in the past have taken the lead in every great movement within this nation, whether in time of war or in time of peace. It is well to have our cities prosper, but it is not well if they prosper at the expense of the country. In this movement, the lead must be taken by the farmer themselves, but our people as a whole, through their governmental agencies, should back the farmers. Everything possible should be done to better the economic condition of the farmer and also to increase the social value of the life of the farmer, the farmer's wife, and their children. The burdens of labor and loneliness bear heavily on the women in the country. Their welfare should be the especial concern of all of us. Everything possible should be done to make life in the country profitable so as to be attractive from the economic standpoint. And there should be just the same chance to live as full, as well-rounded, and as highly useful lives in the country as in the city. The government must cooperate with the farmer to make the farm more productive. There must be no skinning of the soil. The farm should be left to the farmer's son in better and not worse condition because of its cultivation. Moreover, every invention and improvement, every discovery and economy should be at the service of the farmer in the work of production. And in addition, he should be helped to cooperate in business fashion with these fellows, so that the money paid by the consumer for the product of the soil shall, to as large a degree as possible, go into the pockets of the man who raised that product of the soil. So long as the farmer leaves cooperative activities with their profit sharing to the city man of business, so long will the foundations of wealth be undermined and the comforts of enlightenment be impossible in the country community. The present conditions of business cannot be accepted as satisfactory. There are too many who do not prosper enough, and of the few who prosper greatly, there are certainly some whose prosperity does not mean well for the country. Rational progressives, no matter how radical, are well aware that nothing the government can do will make some men prosper, and we heartily approve the prosperity, no matter how great, of any man if it comes as an incident to rendering service to the community. But we wish to shape conditions so that a greater number of the small men in business, the decent, respectable, industrious, and energetic men who conduct small businesses, who are retail traders, who run small stores and shops, shall be able to succeed, and so that the big man who is dishonest shall not be allowed to succeed at all. Our aim is to control business, not to strangle it, and above all, not to continue a policy of make-believe strangle toward big concerns that do evil, and constant menace toward both big and little concerns that do well. Our aim is to promote prosperity, and then to see that prosperity is passed around, that there is a proper division of prosperity. We wish to control big business so as to secure, among other things, good wages for the wage workers and reasonable prices for the consumers. We will not submit to the prosperity that is obtained by lowering the wages of working men and charging an excessive price to consumers, nor to that other kind of prosperity obtained by swindling investors or getting unfair advantages over business rivals. We propose to make it worthwhile for our businessmen to develop the most efficient business agencies. But we propose to make these business agencies do complete justice to our whole people. We're against crooked business, big or little. We are in favor of honest business, big or little. We propose to penalize conduct and not size.